So, original sin. Tony Jones, last Lent, wrote a book called A Better Atonement, Beyond the Depraved Doctrine of Original Sin. And I guess if by original sin you mean some curse that God put on us because Adam and Eve, thousands of years ago, disobeyed him, then the doctrine does end up being depraved. It ends up being not satisfactory on a whole lot of levels, not least because our scientific understanding of the origins of the human species aren't really compatible with understanding the Genesis account of the fall as a literal historical event. But also because of the sort of statement it makes about the moral character of God, who ends up being sort of vindictive. It doesn't make any sense that we should be held responsible for the actions of people who are not alive anymore. And it just isn't really compatible with our understandings of God's loving, merciful nature. But I think that that's a fundamentally flawed understanding about what the historically held, traditional, orthodox Christian doctrine of original sin is ultimately about. And what it's ultimately about, the way I see it, is simply that we were created to be better than this. That we are not currently all we were meant to be. And we are not currently all that we, with the grace of God, are capable of being. That's good news. That's a message of hope. Because when we look at the world around us, original sin is sort of present, omnipresent. G.K. Chesterton used to say that it was the only doctrine that was empirically verifiable. So, when we look at original sin, what it's saying isn't that we are fundamentally depraved. It's saying that we're fallen from a state that's better than depravity. And of course the good news is that through the incarnation, God has entered our sinful nature, shared it with us, and in so doing, given us the tools by which we're able to break out of it. A Christianity without original sin is ultimately a Christianity without much hope. And so it's really, really important that we talk about it. I basically gave what I've said now as a sermon at a Christmas Lessons and Carols service. And it was really appropriate there because, of course, that service starts with the account of the fall and then ends with the incarnation. And when we see that redemption story as part of itself, together, we sort of see what the Christian story is. And yes, it's absolutely true that if we sort of look to the Adam and Eve story in Genesis as an explanation for where original sin comes from, it's not sufficient to the task. But if we understand that original sin is a fact of life that we deal with every day, then I think we can understand that account, that narrative, that inspired scripture, as the attempt of its authors to come to terms with that in a way that's inspired without necessarily being the explanation of what happened. Why sin exists is a holy mystery. It's sort of internal, intrinsic to ourselves in the sense that it's our rebellion against God for which we are responsible. At the same time, it's intrinsic because we are born into it and without the grace of God, we're impossible to escape it. I think we need to accept that mystery. That's sort of the mystery that we're born into when we enter this world. And did the authors of Genesis unravel it successfully? No, of course not. But I think they were able to acknowledge it and to give us an into understanding sin in a way that's not perfect. I mean, it's not some sort of systematic theology that's going to answer all our questions, but really is deserving of its place in sacred scripture. And that's all we need to know, because that's only half the story. The incarnation comes in. Again, God enters into our sinful nature without having a sinful nature of God's own, but does that freely out of love, emptying Christ's self, taking the form of a slave. As the ancient Christian hymn that St. Paul quotes says. And in doing so, sets us free from sin forever. So that we know that this is not the best that we can hope for. This is not what we're created to do. This fallen world is improvable. And the kingdom of heaven is coming. And if it weren't for original sin, I don't think we could say any of that. So, as progressives, as liberals, as post-liberals, as whatever we want to call ourselves, emergent, Episcopalian, whatever, not conservative, original sin isn't something that we can let go. It's a doctrine that we need to celebrate. Because without original sin, the incarnation isn't really all that meaningful. And it is.